always thought our family was the picture of perfection, at least from the outside looking in. We had the house that neighbors admired, a two-story colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn. My mother took pride in keeping it that way, spending hours tending to the garden, making sure every flower bloomed just right. My father worked long hours at his law firm, coming home every night to a meal that my mother had prepared with meticulous care. And then there was my younger brother, Ethan, the golden child, the apple of my parents' eye. Our house was filled with the kind of warmth that came from routine. Breakfast at 7 sharp, my mother flipping pancakes while my father read the news on his tablet. Ethan sat at the table, swinging his legs under the chair, chattering about whatever had occupied his mind that morning. And me? I was always there, always present, but more like an afterthought. If my father addressed me, it was usually a reminder to do something: pick up Ethan from school, make sure he ate his lunch, help him with his homework. My mother, though more affectionate, had a way of making her love feel conditional, like it was something I had to earn. But I didn't question it. Not at first. Our house was full of traditions, small but significant. Sunday movie nights, where we'd all pile onto the couch and watch my father's favorite classics. Summer barbecues in the backyard, where my mother would set the table with her best dishes, even if it was just us. Family vacations every year, always to some beach destination where my parents could relax while Ethan and I played in the sand. These were the moments that made up our lives, the pieces that, if arranged in a photo album, would make us look like the kind of family people envied. And for a long time, I convinced myself that we were exactly that. Our house always smelled like vanilla and citrus, a scent my mother carefully curated with candles and air fresheners. It was the kind of home where everything had its place, where the furniture was polished to a shine, and where imperfections were quickly corrected. My mother was obsessed with appearances, with making sure people saw us the way she wanted us to be seen. She hosted dinner parties for my father's colleagues, meticulously planning the menu days in advance, her laughter ringing a little too high whenever she entertained. My father, though quieter, thrived in these gatherings, slipping effortlessly into conversation with men who respected him and women who admired him. He had that kind of presence, the one that made people listen when he spoke. Ethan, of course, was always the center of attention. He was 10, full of energy, and had the kind of charisma that made adults adore him. He could get away with anything: a spilled drink, a broken vase, even a smart remark, because my parents thought he was charming. "Boys will be boys," my father would say with a chuckle, ruffling Ethan's hair while my mother smiled fondly. And then there was me. 17, quiet, responsible. The one who picked up the slack when my parents were too busy. The one who helped Ethan with his school projects, made sure he had his lunch packed, and comforted him when he had nightmares. I didn't resent it. Not at first. I was the dependable one, the one my parents could trust to keep things running smoothly. If something went wrong, if Ethan got in trouble, if my mother was too overwhelmed to deal with a situation, it was me they turned to. "Be a good girl," my mother would say, pressing a kiss to my forehead before handing me a list of things to do. And I was. I was always good. Always obedient. Always the daughter they expected me to be. For a long time, I thought that was enough. Looking back, I realize our family wasn't perfect. It was just well-rehearsed. We all played our roles seamlessly, like actors in a long-running performance. My father, the hard-working provider. My mother, the devoted homemaker. Ethan, the golden child. And me, the afterthought who made sure everything kept running smoothly. I never complained. What was the point? If I needed something, it was always met with a sigh or a reminder of how much my parents already did for me. If I wanted to go out with friends, my mother would tilt her head and say, "But who's going to watch Ethan?" If I asked my father for help with something, he'd glance up from his paperwork and say, "You're old enough to figure it out." Ethan, of course, never had to figure out anything. If he forgot his homework, my mother would drive to school and drop it off. If he didn't feel like cleaning his room, I was the one told to do it. "You're the big sister," my parents would remind me, as if that was supposed to explain everything. The thing is, I didn't hate Ethan. He was just a kid. He didn't know any better because no one had ever made him responsible for anything. But as I got older, I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. Like the way my mother's patience with me was always thinner than with him. If Ethan threw a tantrum, she'd soothe him, stroke his hair, tell him everything was okay. But if I so much as raised my voice, I was being disrespectful or ungrateful. If Ethan made a mess, it was brushed off with a laugh. If I left a single dish in the sink, I got a lecture about responsibility. I learned to bite my tongue, to keep my head down, to do what was expected of me. Because at the end of the day, it was easier that way. That was our family. A well-oiled machine. Predictable. Unchanging. And then my parents announced we were going on vacation. The trip was supposed to be a chance for all of us to relax, a week at a luxury beach resort, far away from responsibilities. My mother was giddy as she packed, folding designer swimsuits into neat little stacks, already talking about the spa treatments she and my father would be booking. My father, as usual, was focused on logistics, double-checking reservations, and making sure his work wouldn't interfere too much with their plans. Ethan was the most excited, bouncing around the house talking about the ocean, the jet skis, the all-you-can-eat dessert bar. He was already planning out our days before we even left. I should have been excited too. I wanted to be. But something gnawed at the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite place yet. The flight was long, but the resort itself was breathtaking. Pristine white sand, turquoise waves, palm trees swaying lazily in the breeze. Everything was designed to be perfect. The staff greeted us with smiles, handing my parents tropical drinks the moment we stepped into the open-air lobby. Our suite was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the beach. Ethan ran straight to the bedroom he wanted, calling dibs without waiting for anyone else. My parents laughed, indulging him like always, before turning to me. "You don't mind the couch, do you?" my mother asked, already unzipping her suitcase. The couch. In a five-star resort suite, I was expected to sleep on the couch. I wanted to argue, to say that maybe, just once, Ethan could sleep there instead. But I already knew how that would go. I forced a smile and nodded. Of course not. It was fine. It was just 1 week. The first 2 days were tolerable. I read by the pool while my parents lounged with cocktails, and Ethan splashed around in the shallow end. We had fancy dinners, went on boat rides, and for a while, it almost felt like a real vacation. Then, on the 3rd day, my mother mentioned it casually over breakfast. "Your father and I are going on a day trip into the city tomorrow. There's this incredible vineyard we've been dying to see." I nodded, taking a sip of my orange juice. "We'll be gone all day," she continued, stirring cream into her coffee. "So, you'll watch Ethan." I almost choked. "What?" She blinked at me, as if she didn't understand my confusion. "You'll stay with Ethan. It's just 1 day." But nothing, my father cut in, already scrolling through his phone. "We're not asking you to do much. Just make sure he doesn't get into trouble." I looked at Ethan, who was happily stuffing his face with waffles, not concerned in the slightest. Of course he wasn't. This was completely normal to him. I set my fork down. "Can't we, I don't know, get someone from the resort to watch him?" My mother's lips pursed. "Why would we do that when we have you?" Because I was supposed to be on vacation too. Because I wasn't the live-in babysitter they seemed to think I was. But I already knew there was no point in arguing. So I did what I always did. I swallowed my frustration and nodded. Okay. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my mother rummaging through her suitcase. Sunlight streamed in through the massive windows, casting golden streaks across the marble floor. I turned over on the couch, trying to pretend I was still asleep, but it was useless. My parents were already dressed, my father buttoning up his expensive linen shirt while my mother adjusted her sun hat in the mirror. "Are you sure you'll be fine with Ethan?" my mother asked, her voice light, almost rehearsed. It wasn't a real question. She had already decided the answer. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes. "Yeah, I guess." She smiled, pleased with my compliance, and picked up her purse. "Good girl. There's money on the counter if you want to order something. Keep Ethan entertained, and don't let him out of your sight." My father barely looked up from his phone. We'll be back late. Don't call unless it's an emergency. And just like that, they were gone. Ethan was still asleep in his room, sprawled out in the massive bed that should have been mine. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty suite, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Everyone else at the resort was getting ready for another perfect day, couples heading off to excursions, families going down to the beach, laughter echoing in the hallways. Everyone was on vacation. Except me. I should have been used to it by now. I had spent my entire life putting my own wants aside for the sake of this family. But something about this felt different. Heavier. By noon, Ethan was up, rubbing his eyes as he stumbled into the kitchen. He yawned dramatically before looking at me expectantly. I'm hungry. There's room service. He grinned, plopping down on the couch. Cool. You order it. I stared at him. You have hands, don't you? He blinked, clearly caught off guard. But Mom always. Well, Mom's not here, I cut in, sharper than I intended. Ethan pouted, but eventually, he reached for the phone and ordered himself a mountain of food. He didn't even ask if I wanted anything. The day dragged on. Ethan wanted to go to the pool, then to the game room, then back to the pool. Each time I followed, feeling more like a reluctant babysitter than a sister. While other teenagers my age were lounging in the sun, taking selfies, or flirting with cute resort staff, I was watching a 10-year-old do cannonballs into the water. By evening, my patience had worn thin. Ethan had spent the last 2 hours demanding my attention, asking me to play games with him, nagging me to get him more snacks. Every time I tried to sit down and read, he found a new way to interrupt me. Hey, let's go to the arcade. No. But I'm bored. Not my problem. He scrunched up his face like he was about to throw a tantrum, the kind that would make strangers turn their heads and stare. I'm telling Mom you're being mean. I let out a humorless laugh. Go ahead. Tell her. Ethan hesitated, like he wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't used to me pushing back. Usually, I just went along with whatever he wanted. But I was done. I grabbed my book and sank into the couch, pretending he wasn't there. Ethan huffed dramatically before storming off to his room, slamming the door behind him. For the first time that day, I exhaled. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it. By the time my parents returned that night, I had already decided not to say anything. What would be the point? They wouldn't listen. They never did. Complaining would only make me sound childish, ungrateful. I could already hear my mother's voice in my head. It was just one day. Stop being so dramatic. They stumbled in sometime after 10, my mother's laughter too loud, my father's shirt slightly wrinkled like they had spent the whole day drinking expensive wine and enjoying themselves while I spent mine chasing after Ethan. My mother beamed as she kicked off her sandals and stretched like she had just come back from the most relaxing spa day. Oh, what a dream, she sighed, dropping her purse onto the counter. The vineyards were stunning, and the restaurant to die for. My father tossed his wallet onto the table and loosened his collar. Best wine I've had in years. I didn't say anything. I was still curled up on the couch, book in hand, pretending I wasn't listening. But I could feel it coming. The moment my mother glanced around the room and saw that Ethan wasn't there, she frowned. Where's your brother? I flipped a page. In his room. She made a face. You just let him sit in there all night? I forced myself to stay calm. He spent the whole day at the pool. Then the arcade. Then back to the pool. He's fine. My mother sighed, shaking her head like I had somehow failed at the very simple task of watching him. Then Ethan's door creaked open, and he stepped out dramatically, rubbing his eyes like he had just suffered through the worst day of his life. Mom, he whined. She was so mean to me. I clenched my jaw. Of course. My mother's expression immediately hardened. She turned back to me. What did you do? I stared at her, waiting for the usual "Are you okay? What happened?" But of course, that question never came. It never did. Because she had already made up her mind. I was the villain here. Nothing, I said flatly. I watched him all day. Took him wherever he wanted to go. He just didn't like that I wouldn't play games with him every second. But Ethan knew how to play them better than I ever could. His face crumpled, his lip trembling just enough to look convincing. She ignored me, he mumbled. She didn't even talk to me. My mother's eyes flared with disapproval. That's not how you treat your brother. My father, who had been silent up until now, finally chimed in, his voice laced with exhaustion. We leave you with one responsibility, and you can't even do that, right? Something inside me snapped. I slammed my book shut and stood up. Are you kidding me? I gave up my day for him. I followed him around this stupid resort while you two were off drinking wine and having fun. And I'm the bad guy because I didn't cater to him every second. My father's expression darkened. Watch your tone. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Oh, I am watching it. I'm watching all of this. I gestured to Ethan, who was now smirking slightly because he knew I had already lost. My parents weren't looking at him, weren't seeing the satisfaction in his face. They were only seeing me, the problem child. My mother sighed dramatically, rubbing her temples. This isn't that big of a deal. You're being overly sensitive as usual. Overly sensitive. Right. Because it was never them being unfair. It was me overreacting. It was me expecting too much. It was me who needed to adjust. I took a deep breath, pressing my nails into my palm to keep from saying something I'd regret. I had spent my entire life accepting that this was how things were. That I would always be treated like an afterthought. That I would always come second, no, not even second. Last. But for the first time, I wondered, what if I didn't accept it anymore? I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked toward the balcony, needing fresh air before I exploded. My mother called after me, telling me to stop being dramatic, but I ignored her. I gripped the railing, staring out at the dark ocean stretching endlessly beyond the resort. Something had changed in me, and my parents had no idea. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of guilt, no, I had stopped feeling guilty a long time ago, but because my mind was racing. Every word my parents had said replayed in my head, every dismissive glance, every sigh of disappointment. I kept seeing Ethan's smug little smirk when he realized he had won again. And for what? Because I hadn't treated him like the king of the resort? Because I had dared to act like my time mattered too? I lay on the stiff couch, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily above me. My parents' room door was shut, and I could hear my father's faint snoring. Ethan's bedroom door was slightly open, a sliver of blue light from his tablet glowing in the dark. He was probably still awake, playing games, not a care in the world. And why should he care? He got everything he wanted. Always. That was the moment I decided. I was done. This was their vacation, not mine. My parents had made that perfectly clear. I was nothing more than an accessory, a built-in babysitter, an afterthought. And if they expected me to keep playing along, to keep smiling and nodding and being their obedient little helper, they were about to be very, very surprised. I reached for my phone, my fingers moving almost automatically as I pulled up a flight booking app. I wasn't going to sit here and waste another second of my life catering to them. If they wanted to treat me like I was invisible, then I'd show them exactly what that looked like. One-way ticket. First available flight. I scanned through the options, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a flight leaving at 10 a.m., not ideal, but doable. I could slip out early, grab a cab to the airport, and be gone before they even realized I wasn't in the suite. By the time they figured it out, I'd already be on my way home. A rush of satisfaction filled my chest. They'd be furious. I hesitated for half a second before clicking purchase. The confirmation popped up on my screen, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had control. Like I was choosing something for myself. I wasn't just leaving. I was taking back my life. I slid my phone under my pillow and exhaled slowly, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Excitement. Maybe even a little bit of revenge. Tomorrow, I was leaving them behind. And they wouldn't see it coming. Morning came fast. I had barely slept, my body buzzing with adrenaline as I went through the plan over and over again. My suitcase was already packed, not that I had much to begin with. Just a few outfits, some toiletries, and my essentials. I didn't need anything else. I wasn't planning on coming back. The suite was quiet when I slipped out of bed. My parents were still asleep, and Ethan's door was cracked open, the faint sound of his tablet still playing. Good. That meant I had time. I moved carefully, grabbing my things without making a sound. My phone was already charged, my boarding pass ready. I checked the time. 6:30 a.m. perfect. My flight wasn't until 10, but I wanted a head start. As I grabbed my bag and crept toward the door, I hesitated. For a split second, I wondered if I should leave a note. Something simple. I'm going home. Don't bother calling me. But then I remembered last night. My mother's disappointed sigh. My father's dismissive tone. Ethan's fake pout. No, they didn't deserve an explanation. I walked out without a single word. The resort was still waking up, a few early risers shuffling toward the beach, staff setting up for the day. I kept my head down as I made my way to the lobby, forcing myself to act natural. Just another guest, heading out for the day. When I reached the front desk, I put on my best smile. Hi, I need a taxi to the airport. The woman behind the counter nodded. Of course, ma'am. It'll be here in about 10 minutes. I exhaled slowly. Almost there. I stepped outside, standing in the warm morning air, watching the waves roll in as I waited. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. No more expectations. No more playing babysitter. No more being ignored. The taxi pulled up and I didn't hesitate. I threw my bag in the back seat and climbed in, shutting the door firmly behind me. To the airport, please. As the car pulled away from the resort, I didn't look back. Let them wake up and wonder where I was. Let them panic when they realized their built-in babysitter was gone. Let them finally feel what it was like to be inconvenienced. For the first time in my life, I was free. The airport was busy, filled with tourists rushing to catch their flights, families herding their kids through security, couples sipping coffee before heading to their tropical getaways. I sat near my gate, sipping a bottle of water, my heart still racing. I had done it. I had actually left. My phone stayed silent. No missed calls. No frantic messages. They hadn't even noticed yet. By the time I boarded my flight, I pictured them waking up in the resort suite. My mother, stretching luxuriously before realizing something was off. My father, checking his phone before furrowing his brows. Ethan, stumbling out of bed, rubbing his eyes, expecting me to be there. And then the moment of realization. Where was I? Who was going to watch Ethan now? I bit back a smile as I fastened my seatbelt. Let them figure it out themselves. The flight home was long, but it was the best kind of long. I wasn't dreading what waited for me on the other side. I wasn't walking into another set of rules, another list of expectations. No, this time I was in control. And I wasn't just coming back to leave. I was coming back to take everything they owed me. By the time I landed, I already had a plan. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the taxi stand, giving the driver my home address. The house I had grown up in, the house I had spent my life being overlooked in. But today, I wasn't just going back as their daughter. I was going back as someone who was done playing by their rules. The moment the taxi pulled up to the house, I felt a rush of something almost electric. The front porch light was off, the curtains drawn. They wouldn't be back for at least 3 more days. Plenty of time. I let myself in with my key, stepping into the dark, silent house. The air smelled familiar, vanilla and citrus, the same scent my mother insisted on filling the house with. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Neat. Perfect. I moved quickly. I knew exactly where my father kept his safe, tucked behind the bookshelves in his office, hidden behind the fake spines of law books he never actually read. I ran my fingers along the edges until I found it. Click. The panel popped open, revealing the keypad. He never changed the code. I punched in the numbers, my hands steady. A soft beep confirmed my entry, and then the safe door creaked open. Stacks of cash, neatly bundled. My father never trusted banks completely. He always kept money in the house, just in case. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed what I needed, stuffing it into my bag before shutting the safe again, making sure everything looked untouched. It wasn't stealing. Not really. This was repayment. For every time they ignored me. For every time they made me feel like I wasn't enough. For every sacrifice they expected from me without a second thought. I was done being the good daughter. I left the house the same way I came in, silent, unnoticed. The taxi driver was still waiting outside. I got in, adjusting the bag on my lap. "Where to now?" he asked. I took a deep breath. A hotel, and then somewhere new. For the first time in my life, I had choices. And I was going to use them. The hotel room felt strangely quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind. I sat on the edge of the bed, my bag beside me, the weight of what I had done finally settling in. There was no regret, no second-guessing, only the steady hum of satisfaction. I had finally taken control. When I checked my phone, the notifications flooded in, a never-ending stream of missed calls and frantic messages. My mother had called the most, likely pacing in the resort suite, trying to figure out how her well-planned vacation had fallen apart. My father, less emotional but just as furious, had sent fewer messages, but each one carried the same cold authority he always used when he thought he was in control. Ethan, of course, had sent a few of his own, likely prompted by my mother, but they were nothing more than childish complaints. I knew exactly how they were reacting. My mother would be snapping at the resort staff, demanding answers, convinced that I had simply wandered off like some irresponsible child. My father would be frustrated, already making calls, trying to strategize his way out of the inconvenience of my disappearance. Ethan, caught in the middle, wouldn't truly care. I had always been the one forced to cater to him, and now that I was gone, it was finally their responsibility. They were scrambling, panicking, realizing, for the first time, that I wasn't at their beck and call anymore. I took my time before responding. Not to them. I had no intention of explaining myself, but to my future. The money I had taken from the safe was enough to start over, to finally step away from the role I had been forced into my entire life. I didn't just want distance. I wanted a clean break. A new city, a new apartment, a new life where they couldn't reach me. Without hesitation, I blocked their numbers. One by one, cutting off every avenue they had to drag me back. It was a strange, liberating feeling, like shutting a door that had always been left open, like finally drawing a line they couldn't cross. By the time they returned home, I wouldn't be there. Not waiting for their anger, not bracing for their disappointment, not falling back into their expectations. They would come home to an empty house, a realization that they had lost something they had never truly valued. And I hoped they felt every second of it. As I zipped my bag and stood, I felt lighter than I had in years. I was no longer their forgotten daughter, their backup plan, their built-in caretaker. I was free, and they would have to live with that. I checked out of the hotel the next morning, stuffing the last of my things into my bag before heading downstairs. The lobby smelled like fresh coffee and something sweet, maybe cinnamon rolls from the small cafe near the front desk. A few travelers lingered around, dragging suitcases, sipping their morning drinks, planning their next steps. So was I. I walked outside, letting the warm morning air settle over me as I pulled out my phone. My parents had stopped calling, not that it mattered. They were blocked. I could only imagine the chaos I had left behind. My mother shrieking, my father demanding answers, Ethan pouting because there was no one left to cater to him. Let them panic. I had a bus to catch. I had spent half the night researching apartments in a new city, far enough that they wouldn't come looking, close enough that I could get there in a few hours. A fresh start. A place where I wasn't just the forgotten daughter, the built-in babysitter, the responsible one. I booked a small studio with 3 months' rent paid up front. Cash. No paper trail. No way for my parents to track me down and guilt me into coming back. I was free. As I settled into my seat on the bus, I finally let myself breathe. The road stretched ahead, the city fading behind me. No more expectations. No more being taken for granted. Somewhere back at the resort, my parents were realizing they had lost control over me. And I hoped it burned. I leaned my head against the window, a small smile tugging at my lips. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself.